You begin with an assumption that appears natural. If something feels coherent, it must be true. You trust your conclusions because they seem internally consistent, and you trust consistency because it offers a sense of stability. But when you pause and examine this trust, its foundation becomes unclear. You rely on the mind to verify truth, yet you rarely question whether the mind itself is reliable enough to serve as a final judge. Al-Ghazali began his inquiry from this same point. He recognized that the mind often accepts ideas not because they have been verified, but because they have gone unchallenged. You start to see that certainty may be nothing more than familiarity disguised as truth. Here the question quietly forms: if certainty arises from habit, what happens when habit is interrupted? Al-Ghazali lived in a world saturated with scholarship. Baghdad was filled with jurists, theologians, philosophers, physicians, and mystics, each offering methods for arriving at truth. Rationalists relied on argumentation, theologians relied on doctrine, and mystics relied on inner purification. Amid these competing approaches, Al-Ghazali observed that each group claimed certainty, yet their conclusions conflicted. This contrast led him to question not the doctrines themselves, but the structure of certainty that made each group confident in contradictory claims. You are left asking, how can several incompatible certainties all present themselves as unquestionable? Al-Ghazali reached a point where every form of knowledge seemed questionable. Sensory perception could be deceived. Rational arguments could be constructed to defend opposing positions. Even inherited convictions might simply reflect the environment in which one was raised. The problem was not that knowledge was absent, but that its foundations were unstable. As you reflect on this crisis, you begin noticing how often you trust familiar explanations without inspecting their foundations. The moment you examine them, they lose the certainty they once held. This leads to a deeper challenge. If every instrument of knowledge is fallible, what guarantees the truth of anything the mind affirms? You typically navigate life through routines of thought. Your interpretations, reactions, and expectations form a continuous stream that rarely pauses for examination. Pain disrupts the stream. It interrupts the familiar flow and forces attention onto the present moment. This interruption is uncomfortable, not only because of the sensation itself, but because it breaks the continuity of your assumptions. Al-Ghazali noted that pain reveals the limits of habit. When something disrupts your expected patterns, you confront the fact that your sense of stability relies on uninterrupted familiarity. Pain exposes this reliance. It forces you to see how much of your understanding is simply the result of repetition, not reflection. This realization unsettles the idea that comfort is a sign of correctness. If comfort maintains habit, and habit traps you in unexamined assumptions, then comfort may conceal truth rather than reveal it. You begin to wonder, is pain difficult because it hurts, or because it interrupts the structures you depend on without noticing? As you observe your own experience, you begin to notice how deeply you depend on certain outcomes, narratives, and expectations. Pain exposes these dependencies. When something unexpected occurs, your sense of self feels threatened. You believed you were stable, but pain shows that your stability was contingent on circumstances aligning with your preferences. Al-Ghazali considered this exposure essential. The experience of pain reveals the attachments you thought were intrinsic to your identity. You realize how much your certainty depended on external conditions: health, social affirmation, predictable events, familiar roles. When these conditions shift, your confidence collapses. The collapse does not create fragility, it reveals fragility that was already present. Pain shows that the foundations of your inner stability were never fully internal. They remain dependent on variables outside your control. In this recognition, you see that pain is not merely a physical or emotional disturbance. It is a form of clarification. It shows you the extent of your dependency. You ask yourself, when pain reveals your attachments, is it harming you, or simply showing you what was already unstable? You begin noticing that pain intensifies in proportion to your resistance. When an experience contradicts your expectations, the tension between what is happening and what you believe should be happening produces suffering. The event itself may be neutral, but your insistence that it should be different amplifies the discomfort. Al-Ghazali identified this internal opposition as a major source of suffering. For him, pain becomes a mirror that reflects the extent of your resistance to reality. The more tightly you cling to preconceived ideas of how the world ought to align with your desires, the more severe your experience becomes. This does not imply that suffering is imaginary. Instead, it shows that suffering contains information. It reveals the gap between the world as it is and the world as you demand it to be. When you stop resisting, the intensity shifts. The sensation may remain, but the struggle surrounding it weakens. This observation leads to an uncomfortable possibility. If suffering arises from resistance, does relief depend on changing the event, or changing the stance from which you meet it? As you follow Al-Ghazali's reasoning, you see that pain plays an unexpected role. It redirects your attention. When the structures you relied on begin to collapse, your focus shifts from external certainties to inner awareness. Pain exposes the instability of things you once trusted: your plans, your image, your expectations, your perceived control. Al-Ghazali observed that pain weakens the illusion that external conditions are the source of meaning or identity. When these conditions change, the sense of self built upon them becomes uncertain. This uncertainty forces you inward, toward what cannot be lost or disturbed by external events. This turning inward is not an escape but a revelation. You start seeing that your attention has been scattered across temporary objects. Pain gathers that attention. It directs you to examine assumptions you previously ignored. It pushes you toward the foundation beneath all shifting experiences. When this redirection occurs, pain becomes something other than an adversary. It becomes a signal that misalignment is present. It becomes the point at which clarity begins to form. You find yourself asking, if pain shifts your focus from the fragile to the stable, why is the shift perceived as loss rather than liberation? The ego maintains its sense of control by constructing narratives. It insists that events should unfold according to its preferences, that outcomes should confirm its expectations, and that identity is fixed rather than contingent. Pain disrupts these narratives. When an event challenges your assumptions, the ego's framework weakens. Al-Ghazali saw this weakening not as destruction but as opportunity. When the ego's certainty collapses, a deeper form of awareness becomes possible. You begin observing the part of you that reacts, resists, and constructs explanations. This observation creates distance. You are no longer fully identified with the ego's narrative. As the ego loosens, the mind becomes more transparent. Without the weight of self-justification and expectation, the mind reflects reality more accurately. Pain accelerates this process by stripping away illusions the ego depends on to maintain control. You start to recognize that what you called yourself was often a collection of strategies for avoiding discomfort. When those strategies fail, the deeper layers of awareness emerge. Pain does not create these layers, it reveals them. This leads to a quiet question. If the ego dissolves through pain, is the dissolution a loss, or a return to the part of you that was never shaped by the ego at all? At this point in the inquiry, a shift occurs. You begin to understand why Al-Ghazali treated pain not only as a challenge but as a form of mercy. Pain dismantles illusions you would never abandon voluntarily. It exposes the instability of attachments that appear secure. It breaks the continuity of habits that keep you unaware. It reveals the tension between expectation and reality. and it interrupts the ego's claim to certainty. Through this dismantling, pain makes clarity possible. It removes what blocks understanding. It removes what has been falsely integrated into your identity. It removes what prevents you from seeing the distinction between transient conditions and enduring awareness. Mercy, in this sense, is not comfort. It is correction. Comfort allows illusions to remain. Pain forces you to confront them. You begin to see that what initially appears as loss may, in fact, be the removal of obstacles. This reorientation does not eliminate pain. Instead, it changes your understanding of it. Pain becomes a signal of misalignment rather than a sign of failure. It becomes part of the process through which clarity emerges. At this point, a subtle question arises. If mercy sometimes appears in the form of difficulty, how do you distinguish between what harms you and what frees you? As the inquiry dissolves, you notice that the conflict between pain and mercy begins to fade. When resistance ends, pain loses its meaning as suffering. It becomes a simple indication of where attention is needed. You see that pain does not oppose understanding. It directs it. In this recognition, the mind becomes quiet. Argument is no longer necessary. Explanation is no longer demanded. Certainty no longer depends on external forms. The search for validation loses its urgency. What remains is not a conclusion but a clarity that requires no reinforcement. It is the stillness that appears when the mind stops insisting on how reality should be. And here the final question arises, without pressure for an answer. When even understanding becomes unnecessary, what remains?